Welcome to the Dynamic Design series of podcasts from Foodservice Consultant Society International, FCSI. My name is Michael Jones. I'm the editorial director of FCSI's quarterly magazine, Foodservice Consultant. This is the third podcast in our Dynamic Design series, brought to you with support from our good friends at Atlas Metal. Please check out their website at atlasfoodserve.com. Each podcast interview features a leading FCSI the Americas professional member consultant discussing the key factors affecting the future of food service design. Across the series, we're looking at the 4 key Ps that are required when putting together a design-led food service project: planning, partnerships, presentation, and people. Today we are focusing on why it is essential to marry strong aesthetic design with robust functionality and the correct processes to achieve the right flow when designing a commercial kitchen. Form and function can be happy bedfellows, it would seem, but only when experienced designers fully understand the needs of the customer and the overall goal of the operation. To discuss this, I'm delighted to introduce Joseph Schumaker, FCSI, of Foodspace in Santa Clara, California. Joe, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your business and the areas of the food service and hospitality sector that you specialize in.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks for having me. So, as you said, I'm Joe with Foodspace, and we focus primarily on B&I or corporate dining, and that's most of our work out in the Silicon Valley. Most of our clients are tech companies that are trying to provide a high level of food service amenity to their employees. So that's probably makes up a little more than 80% of our business.
As a consultant, how do you balance form and function in a commercial kitchen from the outset on the design-led projects you work on? And also, why is it important to pay significant attention to both elements and achieve the right balance?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and it's a very timely question too, because I think there's a huge shift happening right now in some of these conversations. From my perspective, I'm a chef. That's my background, and so coming over into the design side, I had to learn how this balance actually works. You know, your natural tendency as a chef is, well, I want my functionality to reign, right? Like everything's got to be based on that. And so now finding that balance between how do we make something aesthetically look really cool to the consumer or to the front end, but then still also maintain that functionality that chefs need and that the culinary team needs to do what they're going to do. And so sitting in the middle of that, for me, has been really challenging and interesting and exciting. And I think right now things are changing a lot. Spaces are getting smaller, so we have to be even more creative.
Joe, have you worked on projects before, or you mentioned as a chef worked in commercial kitchens where the aesthetic presentation, that really cool aspect you were discussing there, the presentation of a front or back of house space has outweighed the functionality to the detriment of the operation? And if so, what are the consequences when that happens?
I think it's sort of our responsibility to try and prevent that from happening as consultants. But on the flip side of that is, yeah, absolutely. I've worked in several kitchens where it just didn't make any sense where they put things or how they laid things out, you know. And so as a designer, I'm every day I'm challenging myself to make sure that I don't make those same mistakes.
Do you believe that great presentation in a front or back of house space can still be achieved on a modest client budget for equipment, etc.? Does beautiful presentation have to cost, or is it more about working smartly?
That's exactly it. I think it's about working smartly. One of the things that I've been doing in my practice is really looking at where can we reduce millwork, where can we reduce things that we know traditionally cost a ton of money, but don't affect the aesthetic. So as an example, a lot of my front counters and even salad bar layouts, they're purely just, chipboard pony walls. And then we skin them, with some sort of nicer, laminate or some sort of a tile or a finish. What that does is it really reduces the amount of wood in these facilities. And let's be honest, that's where a lot of the cost is, especially on the serving counters and things. And I think open kitchens, really do provide an opportunity for this really amazing aesthetic on the front end with different shelving and different heights. But that doesn't have to cost a lot of money either if it's designed in the right way. So I think it's finding that balance between longevity. The other thing is, in my world, especially in the tech world in Silicon Valley, I mean, they're redoing these kitchens every 5 to 7 years anyway. And so, it's a little bit of a different game. I don't feel like, and this isn't just Silicon Valley. I think all over the country, I think we're starting to build facilities that we know are going to get remodeled in some shorter period of time than what it used to be. We aren't building 20-year kitchens anymore. It's just, maybe in the schools and K through 12, but other places we're really just not. And so I think it's finding that balance of maybe we're using a little bit less stainless steel, or maybe we're using a little bit more of sort of traditional, stick construction as opposed to millwork.
You mentioned there about things like serving counters. As a consultant, and in terms of food presentation itself, as a consultant, when you're designing front of house serving areas, the traditional method always used to be to show off this sort of cornucopia of food to the customers in buffets and things like that. Today, where we're seeing much more of a focus on reducing portion size and certainly reducing food waste, how do you still present and show off a food offering while ensuring that food does not also get wasted?
Yeah, I think this is a great point. And I actually think that the technology, some of the technologies like induction, for example, are really helping with this. In the old days, I mean, we really had, full-size steam tables is what we were working with, right, in a hot food buffet environment. And so, the operators got really creative with them. They found all these different sized inserts to try and make things look different, right? Today, I think we're starting to use induction where you can get really precise on time and temperature and things that you need to do per item. Mm-hmm. And so the vessels are changing. They're getting smaller. They look nicer. We're using a lot more cast iron that just sits on the counter and you don't even see the equipment. And so that we were almost like hiding the equipment with the food. And today we don't have to do that. We can get really trick on how the equipment interacts to keep the food fresh and nice. And so that means the vessel sizes have gotten more controllable. And so I think as that continues to develop, I think this issue sort of goes away because now the wares, we've got a smaller footprint. So already the counter was smaller and we've got smaller vessels at our disposal now. And so I think this sort of solves itself as a byproduct of also the shrinking space that we have to work with.
Another, we're talking about presentation here, but another P that we could focus on here is process and ensuring a kitchen flows efficiently. Having worked as a chef, why is it so important to get the right flow in a kitchen? And also, what happens when the flow is wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think flow is probably one of the most understudied and the least amount of time I think is spent during the design process, less than it should be. And I think when you really think about the different types and service styles each station or each area or each dish even could have. In my world, in corporate, we've got this really weird challenge because you're feeding the exact same people every single day of the year.
Right.
And so the variety necessary to feed them at a high level is just ridiculously different than a restaurant, and this is the same in higher ed and other, sort of where you have the same consumer base. So I guess where I'm going with this in terms of process is you have to understand your menu and understand your sort of the movement of where the food's going to start, how it's going to go through the kitchen, where it's going to be held, if it's going to be hot held or cold held. And then from that moment, when the action's actually happening. Because again, back in the corporate world, this action is an hour and a half. It's lunchtime. That's it. And so in that hour and a half, you have to get everything that needed to happen throughout the rest of the 8 hours. You have to get that food out, served, displayed. And so, just thinking through where is that pan going to go? Right? A day in the life of a potato, right? Like what's going to happen? And so, we kind of do this food mapping exercise on a lot of our projects where we get the sample menu from the operator and we actually go through it with them and say, all right, so where are you going to cook this dish? What's the process? What's the timing? And we actually do a flow diagram to show where that particular potato is going to start, get processed, prepped, hot held, served. I've seen both good and bad flows. And one of the challenges is that there's also some jurisdictional issues like ADA laws and some other things that do affect this, that don't make perfect sense for ergonomics or for flow. And so I think our job is to really kind of work within those constraints. One good example of this is a front counter that's too far away from a back counter, right? Because you've got a circulation path in between, right? And so sometimes solving for that, you can't, because there's jurisdictional reasons you have to have those counters that far apart. And so I think it's just our job to really analyze it and then make our best recommendations based on the information that we have in that moment. And then also think through things that, really haven't been thought of yet.
And how do you get that information from a client to make sure you fully understand their needs, their processes, and exceed their expectations?
I think it's a little bit of a balancing act in our world, because sometimes the client has an operator already and sometimes they don't, but almost 100% of the time they aren't food people, so they don't really understand it. And so, step one programmatically is trying to figure out what their goals are. What are they trying to achieve? So, is this a food amenity at a high level that's going to be a free food program and it's Google style, or is it something else, right? And then you kind of go through schematic design, and in a lot of cases, design development, you're pretty far through the process before the operator even gets selected.
Right.
And so, sometimes you have to think a little bit more even outside the box, right? So we have to go in and study demographics. Like, is it a heavy, Asian or Indian population that's going to want a certain type of cuisine? And if so, are we building a station that's specific to that? Because we may not know who the operator is still in that moment. But then I also think you can overanalyze things and make certain things too broad, where an operator is going to come in and go, well, I didn't really get what the station was built to do. And so it's sort of that fine line we run. And each of our clients is uniquely different. And even though it's tech company, Silicon Valley, X number of employees, that doesn't mean it fits some mold, that it's this exact demographic or this exact type of habit. And so I think, our job is to sort of take each of those as a case by case and be really deliberate and, curate sort of the best program that we can with the information that we have and extrapolate, get the client to give you as much information as they can.
What would you say is the most valuable lesson you've learned about the importance of achieving the right flow and the right processes on a design-led project?
I think I'm relearning that every day. I think it's that even if you think on paper you've designed something that's just absolutely brilliant, until it's actually built, you can't be sure. And so I think, the biggest thing or advice or lesson I would take away from this conversation is, measure twice and cut once, right? Like, overthink some of these things, because the reality is that we are still designing, even when we're designing in 3D. And I know a lot of us are using Revit and we're using the 3D tools, which helps a lot. It helps to visualize things. I think the biggest lesson I've learned is that until it's actually built, you don't know for sure. And so slow down, take your time. Don't just copy and paste. And I think those are the things that, hopefully, those are the things that Foodspace is really focusing on and trying to do better.
Many thanks for listening to the third episode in our Dynamic Design series of podcasts from FCSI and Atlas Metal. This podcast has been made possible by the good people at Atlas Metal, a trusted serving equipment partner with a hands-on approach to doing business. See how they're making metal personal at atlasfoodserve.com. Meanwhile, keep your eye on the FCSI website, fcsi.org, for more episodes in the series.